Hi friends, we're gonna make sourdough whole wheat bagels today. And this video is for Dina, Nancy, and Nikki, and anyone else who wants to learn to make bagels. So before I start, I'm just gonna kind of show you the supplies that I use to make sourdough. And this is true for bagels or if I'm just making a loaf of bread or whatever. I have a kitchen scale that measures in grams. If you're gonna get serious about bread baking and especially sourdough, you wanna be able to measure your ingredients by weight. I have a dough scraper. I use this all the time. I would consider these two things to be a must-have, okay? I have a straight-sided vessel for letting my dough rise. My favorite one is an old potato, potato salad container. It's straight-sided. The reason you want that is because when you're letting your dough rise, if it's in a straight-sided container, you know exactly if it's completely doubled in size, or you know how high it's risen, so you can keep your dough from being over fermented. When it is in a big giant mixing bowl, that's rounded, you can kind of eyeball it, but you can't tell really how much that dough has risen. So if you can buy at Walmart, I might have gotten this at the dollar store even, or find some kind of a container that you can hold on to, maybe like an ice cream container, preferably with a lid. That will make your dough rising more exact and you'll get more consistent results. Okay, so making sourdough of any kind is a 2-day process. So it's in the morning right now. The first thing I'm gonna do is feed my start. Now you can time the timing of these steps according to your schedule, but I wanna mix my dough this evening or later this afternoon, so I'm gonna feed my start in the morning. You can feed your start in the evening and then get up in the morning and mix your dough. So like all of these steps are kind of fluid, and sourdough can 100% fit into your schedule. But it's in the morning, I wanna mix my dough tonight, so I'm gonna feed my start. This is my sourdough start. There's not very much in here, as you can see. This is what's left over from the last time I baked. I just always save 25 grams of start when I'm done baking, and I put the lid on it and I put it in the fridge and I don't get it out again until I'm ready to bake. So now that I'm ready to bake, I take out my start. I know there's 25 grams in here that's left over from last time, and I'm going to feed it 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. That's going to give me 100 grams of active start plus 25 grams that always stays in the jar. I know that most of my sourdough recipes take 100 grams of active start. So that is a way for me to feed it to get 100 grams of start and always have 25 grams to stay for next time. You will see a lot of really complicated methods for maintaining your sourdough start, where you have discard and you have to take some and you have to throw it away every time you feed, and you have to feed every couple of days, and I don't have time for that. So this is called the scrapings method. But basically you just save 25 grams every time you bake, and then you feed it according to what your recipe needs that you want to bake. So if I wanted to double my recipe and I wanted to end up with 200 grams of start, then I would feed it 100 grams of water and 100 grams of wheat flour, and then that would leave me with 200 grams of start. If my starter had been in the fridge for like several weeks or even several months and was kind of dormant, I may have to feed it once or twice in small increments to build it up and get it active again. But if I did it in small enough increments, I could activate it and still end up with the amount of start that I needed without having to throw anything away. But because I bake quite regularly, I'm just gonna feed it and I don't have to like reactivate it. So in order to feed my start, I'm just gonna plop it on the scale and I'm gonna press tare so I get a 0. And then I'm just gonna add 100 grams of wheat flour, or sorry, 50 grams of wheat flour and 50 grams of water. And I'm gonna stir it up. Okay, and you want it to be kind of gloppy, not liquidy. And if this was too thick, I could add a little bit of water to thin it out. It's not rocket science. I don't want it runny, but I need to be able to store it, or to be able to stir it and to have it just kind of this consistency. If it were a little runnier, it's not a deal breaker. Like sourdough is not that exact where something, you know, I have a lot of leeway. So now that I've stirred it in and it's well mixed, I'm going to put the rubber band at the level of the start, and I'm going to put the lid back on it, and I'm just going to let it sit on my counter. Now, active sourdough starch should double at room temperature in about 4 to 6 hours. And if your kitchen's really cold, it might take 8 hours. If it hasn't doubled in that time, that tells you that your start is a little sluggish, and that's probably because it's been stored in the fridge for a long time. And if I knew that was the case, after 8 hours and it hadn't doubled, I would just give it like maybe half as much water and half as much flour and mix it up again. And I would kind of keep feeding it until I got it to double within that time period. Do not move forward with any sourdough recipe until your start doubles in the amount of time that it should, or you will not get the rise that you want. Oh, 2 other things that I forgot to mention as far as tools. Because I'm making bagels, I use a little thing like this to get the bagels out of the water that we're going to boil with, because we have to boil them in baking soda water to give them the chewy texture. So this is really handy to get them out of the water. So you want something like this, or something that could serve the same purpose, to kind of scoop them out and shake off the water and put them on the pan. I also have this. This is a Danish dough hook, and it is freaking awesome, but I baked without it for like 20 years. So if you have the opportunity to get this, it's like on Amazon for like 10 bucks. It is so amazing for beating up pancake dough and biscuit dough and, you know, things that tend to be sticky. I love it for the first stages of mixing bread dough, but if I didn't have it, I would just use a spoon. So it's not a must-have, but it's kind of a fun thing that I wonder why I didn't get sooner. Okay, so all I'm going to do now is just set this on the counter and wait for it to double, and once it's doubled, then I'm going to come back and mix up my dough. The recipe for these bagels, I'm just gonna put it in the description for this video, and we're gonna go from there. Okay, so now we're ready to move to the next step. My sourdough start has doubled. It's full of bubbles, smells slightly yeasty. This is ready to go. If for some reason my schedule had changed and I could not move forward with making bread, all I would have to do is put the lid on this and put this in the fridge, and it would stay active and ready to bake for like 48 hours. So I can stop the process at this point if I needed to store this in the fridge until I had more time. So what I have here is my scale. I am going to make this batch with my KitchenAid mixer with the dough hook. So I have the bowl for my KitchenAid, and I'm just going to put this right on the scale, and I'm going to zero it out, and then I'm just going to weigh the ingredients right in here. So I know this takes 100 grams of start. So I'm just going to measure this right out to 100 grams. And as soon as I get that start in there at 100 grams, I'm left with the 25 grams that I started with. So I'm going to put this in the fridge until the next time I want to bake. The other ingredients in my bagels are olive oil, salt, flour, and then for the sweetener, it calls for barley malt syrup or honey. I don't even know what barley malt syrup is. I use unsulfured molasses for that. Because the bagels I want to make right now are kind of sweet breakfasty bagels, I'm going to actually double the sweetener. So in this case, I'm going to add 43 grams of barley malt syrup, or the molasses, and 43 grams of honey, because I'm doubling the sweetener because I want to make these bagels kind of sweet, so for breakfast with like fruit flavored cream cheese. I'm also going to add some cinnamon and some vanilla. This is how I make my vanilla. I put the vanilla beans right in there, and then when I add some to the dough, it's some for the dough and some for me. Just kidding, you know I don't do that. But anyway, so I'm going to put the cinnamon and the vanilla in. If I were going to add something like raisins, or like if I were going to make orange cranberry bagels, I would not add anything chunky at this stage. I would add it later, but cinnamon is not chunky. And the reason for that is, as I'm beating the dough and forming the gluten strands, I don't want anything in the dough that's going to tear the gluten strands, like dried cranberries or raisins or nuts or whatever I'm going to add. I don't want those added to the dough at this point. And that's true no matter what I'm making. Even if I were making a loaf, like a banana nut loaf or something that I was kneading and I was trying to build gluten structure, I wouldn't add anything chunky at that point. So I'm just gonna, every time I add an ingredient, I'm just gonna zero out my scale, and I'm just gonna add everything right into the container. That is another reason why it's great to go by weight, because I'm not messing with measuring cups. I'm just putting it right in, and then I zero out my scale and go to the next one. So I'm going to add all of my ingredients. This particular batch is going to be made with a mixture of hard white wheat, Coruscant or kamut flour, and spelt. And I just use those as I have them. You could use either one of those alone. You could use a mixture. I could also use rye, but those are the grains that I work with the most. So I'm going to get that added, and then we're going to go to the next step. Okay, I've added all the ingredients, and I took my Danish dough whisk, and I've just mixed it up so that it's kind of a shaggy dough and all of the flour is incorporated. The next thing I'm going to do is put this on the KitchenAid and kind of start the mixing process with my dough hook. If you don't have a dough hook, or you want to do it by hand, you still get to this point where you have just kind of mixed it up. There's no loose flour and things are starting to stick together. And I'll show you that step next after I show you what it looks like on the KitchenAid. Got my dough hook set up, and I am going to run this on low speed. Maybe a little bit higher. I'm just trying to get it to grab the dough and start making a ball. And if it doesn't, I actually will kind of mix it closer together so it can grab onto that dough. All right, here we go. All right, it's grabbing onto the dough. I've just got it on low speed. And when the dough hook starts moving that dough around, that's when I count it as starting. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to let this mix like this on low speed for probably a minute. See, if I turn it up, it's too aggressive. I might do that for like 5 or 10 seconds, but really I'm going to keep it on low and just kind of work the gluten like that. And if it starts looking like it's getting sticky and sticking to the bottom of the bowl, that tells me it's time to turn the mixer off because the gluten's getting overworked. So I'm just going to let it go like this. And then I'm going to turn it off and let it sit. It's been mixing for a few minutes. I am going to turn it off. It's only been like 1 or 2 minutes. And one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to scrape down the sides of the bowl and make sure that all this stuff on the sides gets added to the dough, because this stuff on the sides of the bowl is going to dry like asphalt. And why should I clean that later if I can add it to the dough now? So I'm going to make sure the bowl is clean. And now I've just kneaded it for a few minutes. I am going to let it sit for 10 or 15 minutes where it will continue to develop gluten while it's just sitting there. And then I'm going to come and knead it for a minute or two and let it sit again. And I'm going to repeat that process probably 2 or 3 times, and then I'm going to check for window pane, and I'll tell you what that is as we get further in the process. This is the most time-consuming part of making the dough, is just this period of time where we're mixing it and letting it rest. Now, the reason that we do that, rather than just putting it on the dough hook and beating the heck out of it for 10 minutes, is because the gluten in the ancient grains like spelt and kamut is much more delicate. And if I were to do that and beat it for 10 minutes straight, like a lot of white bread recipes will tell you to do, I would actually overmix this bread and I would destroy the gluten. I would break the gluten down. So hard white wheat by itself is a commercially developed grain that has a stronger gluten content. And so I could, if I were just using straight hard white wheat, I could mix it a little bit more aggressively. But to be perfectly honest, I use the same process even if I haven't added any of the ancient grains like spelt or kamut that need to be treated more delicately. So I'm just going to let this sit. Repeat the process a couple more times, and then I'm going to show you how the dough has changed from this process, but it will develop gluten and become more elastic just while it's sitting here like this. If you do not have an electric mixer with a dough hook and you're going to do everything by hand, you're going to take your dough that has been mixed up, everything's incorporated, but it's still a really rough looking dough, it's not smooth, and you're just going to put it on your counter, covered with either the lid to the bowl, saran wrap, or a wet tea towel, just something to keep it from drying out, and you're going to let it sit for at least 15 minutes. I'm going to let mine sit for 30 minutes because I'm not in a rush. But what will happen is while it sits, this dough will develop gluten, even if you're not doing anything with it. So if you look at it now and you were to pull on it, it has very little stretch. I mean, you try, oh, actually, well, it's been sitting for a minute before I turned the camera on, so it's already starting to develop some. But when you pull the dough, it breaks off pretty easy, right? So there's not a lot of gluten developed. We're gonna see when we come back in 30 minutes, you'll see how much more stretchy it is just after sitting by itself, like with no touching. And then we're going to do what's called stretch and fold, and that's the method that we use if we're not using an electric mixer. This is the dough that I'm mixing by hand, and it has been sitting here for a few minutes. It's going to be really sticky, but I'm ready to start doing some stretch and folds. So in order to touch it without having it stick to my hands, I have a little cup of water here, and I'm just going to wet my fingers. Oh, you can tell I've been painting. Anyway, I'm going to wet my fingers, okay, and I'm going to show you. Look at this dough, how much elasticity it's gained. Look at this. Remember before how it was just, it would kind of tear off? Look how stretchy this is now, and it's just been sitting here. But I'm going to start doing stretch and folds, okay? This is the alternative to having a dough hook. So all I'm going to do, in fact, I'm going to take it out and put it on the counter just to show you, but normally I would do it in the bowl, okay? I'm stretching and folding. So I'm taking one hand and kind of holding it, and I'm just stretching and folding, and then rotating the dough, stretching and folding, stretching and folding. Now I could do the whole old-fashioned thing where you take it and you go, oh, and you knead it, but this stretching and folding is easier to me. The point is you want to work it for a few minutes and let it rest, work it for a few minutes and let it rest until we get to window pane. So my method, I like stretching and folding. So now that you've seen the technique, I'm going to put it back in the bowl, and I'm just going to do stretch and folds. I might do like 5 stretch and folds. Every time I do it, the dough gets more elastic, okay? And then after I do that, I'm going to cover it back up, and I'm going to let it sit for 20 or 30 minutes. It's going to continue developing gluten, and you'll kind of tell when it's done, stretch and folding, because it'll get firm, and then you can't stretch it anymore. And okay, I've stretched that dough out as far as it's going to go. Now it's like in this neat little ball, and I'm just going to set it aside, and I'm going to do the same thing that I just did 3 or 4 more times, and then I'm going to start checking for what's called window pane. You have to get to window pane before you go to the next step. When you're working with wheat bread, where you're trying to build gluten structure, you have to get to window pane. Do not move on until you get to window pane. So window pane is the same, whether I'm using the dough hook or the stretch and fold method. So now you've kind of seen how you work the dough both ways. I'm going to move forward with the dough on the dough hook, but now you kind of know the process for both sides. Then 3 or 4 rounds of mixing it for a few minutes and then letting it rest, and my dough is becoming very elastic. I think it's time to start checking it for window pane. So look how elastic this dough is, and nice and stretchy. So to check for window pane, what I'm doing is just taking the dough and seeing if I can gently work it thin enough so that I can see light through it without it tearing. And you can see, look at that. That is a beautiful window pane. And I did not have to mix it extensively or beat it to death. It was just a little bit of mixing with rests in between, and the dough really developed this beautiful gluten structure with very gentle handling. And that's the best way I have found to do it with whole grains. But look at that window pane. Now it doesn't matter whether I am doing this by hand with the stretch and folds or with the mixer. I'm going to get to this point with either method. So once I've gotten to this point, I can put it in my straight-sided vessel. This is the point in the recipe where we're getting ready for the bulk ferment. In sourdough, it's called bulk ferment. Some recipes will call it the first rise. I'm going to mark. I'm going to put it in here so it's nice and kind of even, so that I can mark the outside of my container so I know where the dough was. I'm going to put the lid on it, and I need to let this rise. I'm going to let it rise to where it's almost double, but not completely doubled. And I have to keep an eye on it, because if I let it get more than double, it is going to be over fermented and the dough will not hold its shape. It won't turn out well in the oven, and it'll be really sticky and kind of a nightmare to work with. So you don't want to let it over ferment. But because this is sourdough and it's natural yeast, it's going to take anywhere from probably 5 to 8 hours to get to where it's almost double in size. If I am short on time and I need to kind of put this process on hold, this is a great point where I could put this in the fridge and I could by myself overnight and pick this up the next day, or resume the process later when I have more time. But because I'm going to be around and I can keep an eye on the dough, I can just let this rise to almost double, and then we're going to move on to the next step after that. Now, if I did put it in the fridge because I'm not ready to proceed now, I would get it out and it would look just like this. It's not really going to rise in the oven or in the fridge because that just retards the process and it kind of goes dormant in the cold. So if I got it out of the fridge when I was ready to proceed to the bulk ferment, I would let it come to room temperature and then I would let it rise to almost double. So whether it's before the fridge or after the fridge, I need this dough to get to the point to where it's almost doubled, and then I'm going to be ready for the next step. It is now the next morning and I let my dough rise overnight. So I'm getting up to check it the next day, and it's kind of jiggly and still kind of looks a little domed on top, and so that tells me that this is good. It did not overproof. So I have to go to church this morning and I'm not going to be able to do anything with this dough, but it's already doubled, and so I can't leave it out on the counter anymore or it's going to continue to rise. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop this in the fridge and I'm going to leave it there until I get home from church, and then I'm just going to pull it out and go on to the next step. So I could put this in the fridge, before I let it rise last night, and then let it rise this morning. But since when I went to bed, it was just barely above the red line, and so I felt confident that I could leave it out overnight without it overproofing. So it's going in the fridge now, and then when I get home from church, it'll look just like this, and I'll take it out of the fridge and go to the next step. Okay, I'm ready to pull my dough out of the fridge and shape the bagels. So I'm going to tell you kind of what I've assembled for this stage. I have my scale because I need to weigh each piece of dough to make sure that it's roughly the same. I have my little bowl of water in case the dough gets sticky so I can wet my hands. A timer so I can time the amount of time the bagels are boiling. I have some cornmeal that's going to go on the bottom of the baking pan once they're boiled. I have my little strainer, my dough scraper, a pan that has been sprayed with nonstick spray, and I have a pot of water. I filled it about up to here, and it has 1 tablespoon of baking soda and 1 tablespoon of either honey or molasses. And in this one, I just used honey. And I'm going to put that on the stove, but I'm not going to turn it on yet. So the first thing I'm going to do is decide how many bagels I'm going to make. So this recipe tells you to make 6 bagels, which makes each bagel about 140 grams. Those are like big, they're pretty big bagels, and I find that I want my bagels to be a little bit smaller. So I'm going to do bagels of about 85 grams instead of 140 grams, which is what the recipe says. So if you do 140 grams, that gives you 6 bagels. I want mine to be about 85 grams. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to weigh my dough, and I'm going to figure out how much my dough weighs so I know how many bagels I'm going to get at 85 grams. So I'm just going to put my container with the dough in it on the scale, and it tells me it's 980 grams. I know that this container, when it's empty, weighs 78 grams. Now that's kind of a little trick that you can do. You should know how much your rising containers weigh when they're empty, so that when you weigh the dough like this, so that you know how much to cut, you can subtract the weight of the container without having to take the dough out. So the total weight is 980. I know that this container weighs 78 grams, so that tells me that I have 902 grams of dough inside once I've subtracted the weight of the container. So at 85 grams, I just took my little calculator and I just did the math. At 902 grams divided by 85, that gives me roughly 10 bagels. So I know I'm going to make 10 bagels today. So all I'm going to do is just kind of wet my fingers. I'm going to get this dough out onto a clean counter, and I haven't sprayed the counter with anything. The dough at this stage is not as sticky as it was. And I'm just going to kind of just make sure that it's just a nice smooth ball. Now, if I were going to add in raisins or nuts or dried cranberries or any kind of thing that's chunky, I would do a stretch and fold right now. I would put it in and then I would just gently stretch it in until it was evenly mixed, and then I would proceed with my dough. But since all I'm doing today is cinnamon bagels, that's already been added. But if I were going to add something else, this would be the time. So I know I'm going for 10 bagels. So I'm going to cut it in half, and each half I'm going to just cut into 5 chunks. I'm just trying to get them roughly the same, but I'm going to weigh each one. So this is where you need your dough scraper. Nothing I have found works better than this for cutting the pieces of dough. So I'm just going to pop this on my scale. I'm just using the lid to the container to put the dough on. And I'm just going to weigh each piece. I'm going for 85 grams, so then I just kind of take a little chunk until I get to 85. And I'm going to go through and I'm just going to weigh each of these and just make sure that they're 85 grams. And within, if they go 3 or 4 grams over, I don't mind that. I just make sure that they're within maybe 4 grams of what I'm shooting for. So sometimes you have to add some, sometimes you have to take some away. Okay, so once I've done that with all the dough, here's ones that have already been cut and measured. The way that you shape these, let me get these out of the way so you can see. These are the ones I'm going to go do later, but these are the ones that are already done. I'm going to show you how I shape them. I just take them and make sure that my fingers are wet, so it's not going to stick. And I just kind of make a little ball. It's the same technique that you would use if you were making rolls, right? So you just make this little round ball. I stick my finger right down the middle, okay? And then I just make a little donut. Nothing fancy. They don't have to be spectacularly accurate. And then I put them on the pan that has been sprayed with the nonstick spray, okay? That's all I do. And I put them on the pan so that they're not touching. And I have been able to get a single recipe on 1 half-sheet baking pan. So if I double the recipe, I know that I'll need 2 pans. So on your pan, they're gonna look like that. And because I'm only doing 10, I can space them out more. But if I have more than I'm putting on, I'm not gonna want them to touch. So what I'm gonna do now is finish shaping these and fill the pan. And then I'm gonna set them in a warm place because I want them to rise a little bit. Not double in size, but just to where they kind of puff up and they look like they're cushiony and pillowy and full of air. Because when I put them in the boiling water, I want them to have enough air in the dough so that they will float. So I'm just gonna finish filling my pan. Once I get the pan full, that's when I'm going to turn the heat up on my boiling water, and I'll get that pan starting to boil. And when these are nice and pillowy and puffy, then we will do the boiling phase. All right, my pot of water with the baking soda and the honey is at a full boil. I've already turned my oven on to 425. I have this and my cornmeal and just a little cup of water so that I can handle this dough without having it stick. My bagels are nice and puffy, and I have gone through with wet fingers and just kind of gone around and tucked them around the corners just to make sure that they're nice and round, and like gone back in and just made sure that the holes are pronounced. And I have 2 minutes set on my timer because I'm going to boil each bagel for 1 minute on each side, and then I'm going to flip them over. And if you go a little bit over a minute, that's okay. So I'm just going to, before I pick them up, just make sure the hole in the middle is defined. And I'm literally just gonna pick up the bagels and drop them in the pan, and they float right to the top. And then I'm gonna make sure I start my timer. And so just to show you, where's my pan? They're just floating in there, okay? And I will do maybe 4 at a time. And I'm watching the timer. When there's only a minute left, then I'm gonna flip them over. And then while those are in the pot boiling, I'm gonna take the cornmeal and I'm just gonna sprinkle an even kind of light layer of cornmeal where those bagels were on the pan, so that when they come out of the water, I can put them on top of the cornmeal. So then the pan looks like this. All right, so I'm just gonna flip my bagels over and put them for 1 minute on this side. And you want the hole in the middle to be defined if you can, because you want this boiling water to be able to reach as much surface area as you can, because that's what gives bagels their chew. So you can see that they're just boiling. Oh, look at they're just boiling in there. That's actually the underside of them. So when I take them out, I'm gonna tip them back over and put them on the pan with the side that we started from as soon as I get to 1 minute. And then while I'm waiting, I'll just take my wet fingers and just kind of round up the next 4 that are gonna go in and remake the holes. Whiten them up a little bit. Okay, there's my timer. So then I just pick each one up, kind of shake off the water, and put them on the pan. So I'm gonna finish doing these bagels, and then I'm gonna put them in the oven for about 20 minutes. One's this size, I'll put in for 18 to 20 minutes. I have a little oven thermometer that measures temperature, and before I take the bagels out of the oven, I'm going to make sure that the temperature of the dough is at least 180. That tells me that they're done enough inside to not be doughy. So I might end up putting these in for a full 20 minutes, but I'm going to check them before then just to make sure they don't get too brown on the bottom. And then bake them and put them on a cooling rack, and we're good to go. After 20 minutes in the oven and sitting on a cooling rack for a while, these beauties are ready for some cream cheese. They have a nice golden brown color on the bottom, and they are all ready to be eaten or put in the freezer to enjoy later. So I hope you will make lots and lots of bagels now that you know how.